Sanctions on Niger implemented after a military coup on July the 26th are causing blockades at land borders, preventing vital humanitarian aid like food and medicine from entering the country. The situation has led to increased food prices and altered United Nations aid flights due to jet fuel access issues. Requests for exemptions from regional bloc ECOWAS have not been granted. As a result, essential supplies, including vaccines, are stocked at borders, while security incidents have risen, particularly affecting the displaced population. Now, joining me for this discussion this evening is Professor Mukesh Kapila, former senior United Nations official, and also Dr. Tony Ofoyetan, Director General, International Institute of Professional Security in Lagos. A warm welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining me on the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Now, I'd like to start with Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila. Sir, could you delve into the specific humanitarian aid that has been impacted by the sanctions in Niger? How critical is this aid, especially when it comes to food and medicine? And is it possible for them to allow this aid to come in regardless of the political situation? Because at the end of the day, it's the ordinary people who suffer.
Niger was already a humanitarian dependent country with millions in need of assistance, even under normal times, with the droughts and other problems, as well as the effects of long-standing conflict. Now, for the last few weeks, with no new supplies coming in, the stocks have been running low, and therefore both food and medicines, as well as vaccines and other essential supplies for hospitals and healthcare, have all been affected. So the current projections are that they will run out of all humanitarian aid in coming months, unless there is replenishment, which doesn't appear to be in the offing, at least from the news we are getting.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Dr. Ofoyetan, what rationale do you think have led to the imposition of sanctions on Niger? And how do these measures interlink with the recent military coup? We know there's a coup, there's pressure from ECOWAS and the African Union for the junta to restore constitutional order. And I'm sure those who impose these sanctions understand the humanitarian situation in Niger, as Professor did rightly say, even before the imposition of the coup. So are these sanctions imposed to, try and get the local population to, stand up and oppose this regime and cause popular uproar so that they can restore to constitutional order? What is the rationale behind the sanctions, knowing that there's critical access to food and medicine that is needed for the majority of the population?
Okay, thank you very much. I think let me start by also aligning myself to the position that before now, Niger has actually been, if you call it the headquarters of a humanitarian dependent country, because of the poverty rate that it has been experiencing over the years. Having said so, it's not as if ECOWAS is oblivious of this fact, except for the fact that in order to avoid the kinetic approach when it comes to restoration of democracy in Niger, it is imperative for ECOWAS to take some steps. And one of such steps is the imposition of sanctions. Of course, what sanction does at the end of the day is to make the people to revolt against the government, as it were. Because naturally, it is the people that will suffer the most, not those that are the hem of affairs. So what happens is that when the people get to the brick wall, it is expected that they react. And when they react, the junta starts losing support. And once they start losing support, the implication, of course, is that they also start losing grip of power. So, however, one thing that I am afraid of is whether the junta would actually allow for the quick intervention of the humanitarian aid as it were. Because you and I know that there are surreptitious ways through which the Western world can come in, ECOWAS can come in, and you are talking of issues that have to do with security now, and you are talking of people that are ready to hold on to power for as long as 3 years, as they have indicated to ECOWAS now. So if that is the case, that means that they are going to be looking at, if possible, damning the consequence, as it were. These are military guys. They are not going to quickly jump at the pit or at the argument that the country is already running out of food, running out of medicine, running out of vaccine and the like. And the United Nations has also indicated that some of these vaccines are going to spoil if they are not used on time and all those stuff like that. But what happened is that we see a lot of international game coming into it because it is assumed, as far as I'm concerned, that ECOWAS is not handling this matter the way it ought to handle it. Now we have to look at surreptitious way to now handle it in such a manner that may be favorable. Don't forget that as we speak now, France has defied the order given to the ambassador to leave France within 24 hours. Now that sounds very confrontational.
To leave Niger, you mean? Yeah, and is electricity and lights electricity and water has been cut off?
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, the people are suffering for that. The cutting off of electricity and water, all to make sure that the junta come to their meals. But as it were, we've seen a lot of these measures, and it did not yield the desired result. So what we were expecting was that ECOWAS would be able to negotiate a shorter term, rather than just say blankly we reject the 3-year term. Because the restoration of the former president is as good as done, and you will see that the United States has shifted its own brand from the issue of restoration of power to the former democratic government, but rather looking at how to now look at from a non-kinetic approach, how to look at it that, okay, let's see how do we restore democracy as quick as possible. Don't forget that this is a game of interest. It has nothing to do with democracy, as far as some of us are concerned. Look at what is happening in Gabon today. You will see that a lot of what is happening in Gabon today, the approach is relatively different from what the approach that is being adopted, not meaning that it is so early and so quick. Yeah, and if you look at the juxtaposition, within a twinkle of an eye, there was already sanction on Niger. But as we speak today now, Gabon everybody is still, having its fingers crossed, looking at events as it unfolds. Because the person that took over power seems to be aligned to the US. The one that was removed seems to be aligned to France. So at the end of the day, it is as far as some of us are concerned, as like the France is seen as losing grip of the ability to control the resources in the western or the south and the region. So United States is looking at how do we take over and all those stuff like that. How do we come in? Now that's just my own narrative as it were.
Thank you, Dr. Ofoyetan. We still have a lot to unpack in the course of the program, but I'd like to bring in Professor Kapila back into the conversation. Now, Professor Kapila, you were once a senior official of the United Nations, and it is a delicate balancing act we're seeing here. The United Nations is saying, look, you cannot allow these people to starve, and your sanctions are leading to the blockage of critical aid that is needed for the people of Niger. On the other side, ECOWAS and those who believe, we need to teach the junta a lesson that you do not interrupt a democratic process, and military regimes will not be tolerated. So how do you draw a fine line in, teaching the lessons and also not allowing the innocent people to suffer? Could you elaborate on the United Nations strategies to navigate around the aid blockades arising from the sanctions? How effective have these approaches been so far, and do you see any breakthrough coming through the next few days?
Well, actually, from my experience, both of working in the UN, but also working with ECOWAS in West Africa in the past, is that these are completely different matters. We have sanctions in many, many countries. And in the past, where ECOWAS has got its forces out, like in Sierra Leone and Liberia, with which I was familiar, these were countries with regimes under sanctions. But in those days, ECOWAS forces actually allowed, and more than that, it facilitated humanitarian assistance. And this, I think, helped in finding political solutions. In the current case, I have no idea what's going on, other than to say that ECOWAS is crazy. What it is doing is, by adopting a punitive policy of blocking humanitarian assistance, it's a political own goal. And, you know, makers are not amenable to sanctions. We know from the history of sanctions in many, many other countries, especially in Africa, that if you are the sort of military leader who's going to make a coup, you are not the sort of military leader who's going to be persuaded by.
Sorry to interrupt you, Professor Kapila, but if you don't take punitive measures, if you roll out the carpet for the junta, it might spur a contagion effect. We've seen what happened in Gabon this morning. So ECOWAS needs to show, is there any other way they could show that, look, we're very firm on this situation of military intervention and we will not tolerate it in the West African sub-region without punishing the ordinary people of these countries?
Well, that is the point, isn't it? You know, if you take punitive measures against the people and do nothing against the junta, then of course you reach the limit to your abilities. Now, what to do against the junta is you have to, you know, maybe consider strong personal economic measures and other security interventions. But if you go down the humanitarian blockade route, all you're doing is creating more support for the junta amongst the general population. And we already got evidence that many people support the coup in Niger.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. I would like to bring back Dr. Ofoyetan into the conversation. Now, Doctor, it's intriguing how efforts to pressure the junta intersect with the political landscape of Niger. Can you delve into the potential ripple effects of this situation on the country's governance and stability? How do you assess ECOWAS's efforts so far, and how can we get to a situation where ordinary Nigerians don't suffer? If you look at the land borders, News Central's correspondent Bernard Okede was in Niger a few days ago, and like what Professor Kapila said, it's almost like an own goal, because Nigeria and Niger conduct a lot of businesses. So you have all the trucks lined up on the Nigerian border, unable to go into the country to do their businesses. And at the end of the day, it's a lose-lose situation.
So far so well. I think the first thing ECOWAS has done well is to water down the tendency for military approach and look at it from a non-military approach, which to me is commendable because it takes a lot of humility for ECOWAS to look at at a non-military intervention approach. I think where they are presently is as negotiating as to the duration, when they expect that the juntas would relinquish power to a democratically elected government. I think that is where ECOWAS is going to have a lot of challenge. Because in most cases, when you give such conditions, you are also expected to fund the election. If you look at what has happened in other countries that had suffered this same fate, now some of them are already waiting for ECOWAS funding with respect to elections in those countries. So we want to look at what will be the financial muscle of ECOWAS to be able to fund. I can bet you that that will be one of the conditions the military are going to give when it comes to relinquishing power. And I'm not too sure that ECOWAS is that financially buoyant to be able to fund the election as it were now in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Gabon as it were. And so that becomes a major challenge. But whatever it is, for now, ECOWAS has done relatively well, and I must commend them for that. they've adopted a lot of strategy to ensure that they get the ears of the juntas, and the juntas have also been able to listen, as it were. So I also expect that the juntas would understand that
Dr. Ofoyetan, that ominous cloud still hangs. I mean, if you listen to the meeting of the defense ministers of ECOWAS the last time they met, the spokesperson, they say, you know, this intervention force is ready. We're just waiting for the go-ahead. So there's still that danger and possibility of a military intervention.
Yes, of course. No, it will always be there. It will always be there. And why it will be there is to ensure that the negotiation, there's always, in every negotiation table, there's always a senior partner. And what the senior partner does is to ensure that he is always conscientizing the other party of its ability to be able to subdue the other party. So we call it psychological operation. That is what ECOWAS is doing, and it's expected, and it's good enough so that the junta will understand that in as much as we are speaking to you softly, in as much as we are interacting with you, we also have the military capability to act if we are pushed to act. However, we are not interested in going the military option. So it means that would make the juntas to listen and also look at all the variables, the ones that they can be compromised and all those stuff on the table of negotiation. So it will not be a situation where you talk about breaking news, junta walk out of negotiation table, or junta walk out on ECOWAS team and all those stuff like that. I think that on its own, it's most probably very remote, as it were. But I expect that both parties will come to a meeting ground without going to the battleground. That as it is now, the body language of ECOWAS, the body language of the juntas are also suggesting that. My own major challenge is what will not be the approach of the juntas in view of the defiant nature of the French government when the juntas asked the ambassador to leave within 24 hours, and the French government defied that order in a sovereign nation. I think it will impede on the negotiation of ECOWAS with the juntas. It's most likely going to impede on it. So that means that whatever the juntas would do now, they may have a justification for it. If they insist on certain things, they may have a justification for it. And of course, I also think that whoever has given that advice is not looking at the bigger picture. Because if you are saying that the ambassador should not leave, and they cut supplies to the embassy, and from the embassy and all those stuff like that, for how long can they stay put in the embassy without going out? Now, does that mean that they will be ready to confront the junta militarily? Now, these are issues that now begin to escalate the whole situation rather than become a solution-finding gesture. And I think that the French government should look at do everything. If somebody is saying, leave my country, it does not make any difference whether it's right or wrong. Exactly. That's not what we are saying. For the purpose of not escalating the whole thing, because if you ask me, as it is now, there's a tendency for escalation. That's simple.
At the end of the day, the Nigerian government is the host, and if they ask you to leave, I believe most people should take the honourable part and leave. Thank you very much, Dr. Ofoyetan. Now, Professor Kapila, as we begin to wrap up conversation this evening, striking a balance between the necessity of sanctions and the urgency of humanitarian aid is complex. In your expert opinion, what steps should be taken to address both these concerns effectively in the context of Niger?
With respect, no, the humanitarian imperative is not about striking a balance. The humanitarian imperative to ensure that in the name of humanity, people are fed and watered and not deprived of the basic living is an imperative. It cannot be balanced with security, political or other objectives. If you go down that route, which is more and more what people are doing, then I'm afraid all this means more and more misery with no solutions around the corner. So it is not about striking a balance. It is about recognizing the duty that every decent nation, including a sovereign Niger, has, and ECOWAS has, and France has, and everyone else has, to the humanity of all people.
Thank you very much, Professor Mukesh Kapila. Just before we go, I would like you to touch on the latest development in Gabon. What do you make of this recent coups happening on the African continent? Do you think it's a contagion effect or is it in response to bad democratic practices and governance? What's your take?
Well, my take is that it was sooner than I expected, but it was going to happen because the elections they have just been through were, even by the standards of flawed African elections, worse than usual. And therefore, it was not a surprise what happened. So I think the difference between Gabon and Niger is interesting, because in the case of Niger, we had a reasonable elections with a democratically elected government in power for a few years. In this case, we have an extremely flawed election perpetuating a 50-year-old family autocratic rule. So in the case of Gabon, it's difficult to know on which side to be in. It's a dilemma on what is it we are supposed to be struggling for, because democracy was never there in Gabon to start with.
Thank you, Professor Kapila. Now, Dr. Tony Ofoyetan, in less than a minute, if you can, what's your take on the latest developments in Gabon, the coup that happened this morning?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing spectacular about the case of Gabon. I said it earlier. It's a case of international interest and international infiltration. It has nothing to do with whether election was flawed or election was not flawed. It has to do more with the fact that, the interest of some of these countries are already threatened, that they feel it's more or less a futuristic decision that has to be taken as quick as possible. Because if you are saying that, election was flawed, that should never be a justification for military intervention. There should not be a justification for military intervention if election was flawed in any country. There are judicial means through which such redresses are always attended to. But in a situation where, assuming, and let's concede that election was flawed, and the next thing is for military to take over, who are those that are backing the military taking over? And why are they backing them taking over? And why are we not condemning it the way we condemn that of Niger and all those stuff like that?
Thank you very much, Dr. Tony Ofoyetan. I really wish.
So as far as I'm concerned,
yes.
Yeah.
I really wish we could go on. We'll definitely have a standalone topic to discuss this, but I'd like to say thank you to our distinguished guest, Emeritus Professor Mukesh Kapila, former senior United Nations official, and also Dr. Tony Ofoyetan, Director General, International Institute of Professional Security in Lagos, Nigeria. We do appreciate your time and your insights on the program. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.